Daniel Cullen, and this is Michael Nelson, the Fulmer Professor of Political Science, my longtime friend and colleague, a renowned scholar of the presidency. And I want to mention that it was only a couple of years ago, Mike wrote an award-winning book on called Resilient America, the title that could have been repurposed maybe, on the 1968 election. And just a couple of years later, he's back with not one, but actually two books. We're only going to talk about one tonight, but I want to mention the other one because the books are indeed something of a pair. You can explain that later, Mike, if you want to. One is called Crucible, and it seems to me that's about as close to Fire and Fury as you could get since that was taken. The subtitle is the
President's First Year.
The President's First Year. And I think the informality of that, or rather the formality of that is interesting. It signals something about the institution being the focus. And it's a collection of essays that Mike co-edited. I think he was the lead editor. And it discusses the first year of several presidents, but it also talks about other issues and looks, so to speak, at the presidency in a systematic way. But the book that we're going to talk about tonight is Trump's first year, and that's your book, a year that's certainly involved growing pains. I have a ritual every time one of my kids has a birthday. I go and get the first year baby book down from the shelf and review what happened, and various things happen over the first year, including new words get introduced and used, sometimes inappropriately. That happens in presidential first years too. But I want to say this book is, I think, a terrific distillation of what political science has to tell us about the presidency. But one of the themes of Mike's work has been the distinction between the president and the presidency. And his most famous book and best-selling book, I think, is the Presidency and the Political System. And I'm belaboring this a bit because it seems to me one of the things that brings us all here is this threshold question: how is it that Donald Trump seems to manage to continue to defy the laws of political gravity? Does the political system constrain him in the way that it does other presidents? How should we think about that? And tell us a little bit about why you decided to focus on the first year, and what about the Trump presidency in the political system so far?
Well, you probably all heard the saying, don't judge a book by its cover. But I want you to judge this book by its cover, which I had nothing to do with. But taking a close look at this photograph, I think, is revealing of what I was trying to do in this book. Obviously, you see President Trump there in isolation. And that mirrors, I think, exactly the obsession that almost everyone who writes and talks about Trump has been consumed by, and that is focusing on the ways that he is unusual, even unique in our history. And believe me, there's a lot to go on there, and there's a lot of that in my book. But you also see that Donald Trump is about to step out onto the stage of one of the longest lasting ceremonies in our history under the Constitution, and that is he's about to step out onto the stage of the west front of the Capitol to take the oath of office as part of his inauguration. Take the oath of office that was put into the Constitution when it was written in 1787, and participate in a ceremony that goes all the way back to the first president, George Washington. And so my goal in this book was, without in any way neglecting the ways in which Trump is Trump and nobody else, was to really embed our understanding of his presidency in the larger constitutional system the longest lasting written constitution, national constitution in the history of the world, and also in a history of the presidency, of which he is number 45, not number 1. So Trump didn't get to become president and write his own job description, much as he would have liked to. He stepped into a long line of predecessors, and kind of the mix between the ways in which Trump is very different, and the ways in which he is constrained in the same way all of his predecessors have, by the fact that our Constitution takes the power of governing and slices and dices it among 3 branches within the national government, and then between the national government and the states, the president's in there, but very much embedded in a political system that has the capacity to either support or restrict, or even in the extreme case, remove him from office. And so you might think a book on Trump's first year, chapter 1 would be January, and chapter 2 would be February, and so on. No, the way this book is organized is a chapter on Trump and Congress, a chapter on Trump and the courts, Trump and the state governments, Trump and the media, which, of course, under our Constitution, the freedom of the press, the freedom of the people to assemble and organize, which many Americans have done since he was elected. All of that, I think, is part of the very big picture. And this is unique. I don't think anybody writing about any previous elected president's first year would include a chapter called "The Prospects for Removal," meaning the prospects, which are not, I don't think, likely, but they are certainly within the realm of possibility, that this president will be impeached or removed from office on the grounds of disability. This is a non-trivial possibility.
We'll come back to several of these things. I wanted to follow up first with this. You refer to a political science finding by Paul Light, but there's a pattern with presidents, like driving a new car off the lot, it begins to depreciate immediately, alas, and that presidential influence tends to decrease, but presidential effectiveness increases as there's some learning on the job, so to speak. But you argue that with Trump, you get the standard decreasing influence, but with decreasing effectiveness.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, Paul Light, who is the author of this concept, a political scientist at NYU. By the way, there are a lot of smart people out there writing about the presidency, and I've been able to lean on a lot of their insights. But Paul's point was that over the course of any president's first year, their influence, in other words, their ability to get other in Congress and other constitutional actors to support their initiatives goes down, in part because any president, in making a decision and making a recommendation, some people are going to be disappointed. And over the course of a year, their hopes are going to be dashed, and they're going to, instead of saying I approve of the job the president's doing, are going to say I disapprove. So there's a window there, the so-called honeymoon period that most presidents have during the first few months. And then it's sort of downhill for a while, at least, in terms of their standing with Congress, their standing with the American people. But the other point that Professor Light makes is that there's an offsetting trend, and that is that by doing the job, presidents typically get better at it. There's really no other job in the world that prepares you to be president of the United States. And so we've seen this over the years frequently. People come into the office, they make some rookie mistakes, but they learn from experience, and they just get more effective at doing the job. So why, in Trump's case, certainly his influence, he never had the honeymoon period, in part because he ran a very divisive campaign, and in part because the Democrats responded to it in such a negative way. So he never had that period when 60, 70% of the American people were sort of wishing him well, even at the outset. What we haven't seen is the kind of learning from experience about how to be a more effective president. I'm not saying he hasn't learned anything, but the learning curve, instead of being steep, has been sort of shallow at best. Why? Well, this is a 71-year-old man. I'm 68, so I kind of get it. He's a 71-year-old man who, certainly in his own eyes and by many objective measures, has been successful at everything he's done in the business world, in the world of celebrity television, and as a newcomer to politics, getting elected president of the United States. This is not somebody who's going to spend a lot of time thinking, gosh, I've got a lot to learn, right?
So that makes, it makes perfect sense. But you remember Trump said, you know, I could actually run my business and be president, but I'm not going to run my business because they say I shouldn't.
Right.
But just a very basic element of effectiveness has to do with the fact that you are not only the president, there's a presidency, you can't do it by yourself, so you have to staff up an administration. And when you survey the last year, if there's been carnage, it's been in the White House staff ranks, right, more than anywhere else. What accounts for that? Because again, it seems to be defying the laws of presidential performance 101.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that to be an effective president, you've got to hire people for your staff, your White House staff, and for your larger administration, who bring experience and knowledge and skills to bear that fill the gaps in your own background and preparation. In order to do that, you've got to know people. And Donald Trump, having coming out of the world of non-politics, non-government, really didn't know anybody. He didn't know the kind of people that he would want to recruit. And you know, during the transition period between the election and the inauguration, when he had a transition director who was working to sort of help get him up to speed, Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey, 3 days after the election, he fires him and throws out all the prep work that Christie and his staff had done. So this is somebody who becomes president and doesn't know the kind of people who could help, doesn't know that he needs the kind of people who could help. And if you think about the amount of turnover in Trump's staff during this first year, it's unprecedented for a president. And I think he arrived at some, I think he's in a better place, so to speak, in terms of having people who have learned something on the job.
Is that in part due to Pence, who does know people and has...
Yeah, that is an important exception, and that is when Trump was choosing his running mate, he chose the kind of vice presidential candidate whom any Republican nominee might have chosen. Mike Pence had been a member of Congress, had been a leader in the House of Representatives on the Republican side, governor of Indiana. Mike Pence did know a lot of people. And so at some point, Trump was relying on him to bring in people. But something that was lacking there, and I think has continued to be lacking there, is some sort of sense of history with the folks. If you're the President of the United States, you need to be able to trust the people working around you, that they know what they're talking about, that their loyalty has been tested over time, and you simply don't see that with President Trump. The exception, of course, and this is kind of how he ran his business, his daughter, Ivanka, and son-in-law, Jared, because that's the kind of operation he knew how to run, and having family members there was something that didn't bring in, neither of those two brought in any experience either, but at least people he can trust. And one other thing, there's a lot of evidence that Donald Trump did not expect to win the election. That he was already sort of thinking about, well, how can I cash in on this publicity I've gotten by being the Republican nominee for president to maybe start a new television network, or sell my brand to even more products. And so one of the great surprises of his life was thinking, I've had this great fun, going out and campaigning, and my God, now I've got to do the job, and I don't know how to get from sort of here to there.
Yeah. So on the staffing matter, all the people who are no longer around, I think the one I miss the most is Scaramucci, Tabuch, and which brings us to the communications issue.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan was called the great communicator.
Yeah.
Richard Neustadt wrote that famous book about presidential power not being something the Constitution confers, but it's the power to persuade. I have my phone here in case there's something to retweet. That's the most that's Trump's most famous métier. But is it about presidential communication? Is it an innovative mode of doing an old-fashioned presidential task, or is it, sui generis, and is it effective, not effective, some of each?
President Trump is not terribly effective in using the familiar forms of communication, right? You watch tomorrow night when he gives his State of the Union address. It will be obvious to you that he is reading off the teleprompter, which any experienced politician kind of knows how to make it look natural while they're reading off the teleprompter. But this isn't something he's had experience doing. Press conferences are sort of happenings, right? You never know what is, but they're not the kind of thing that previous presidents have done, really preparing. If I'm going to be asked this, what do I say, and having to say. But what Trump has done, which I think is incredibly innovative, is his use of social media, and in particular Twitter. And I put him in the line of previous presidents who have made breakthroughs in taking new forms of communication with the American people that have come along and figuring out how to use this for their own purposes. So going back to Abraham Lincoln, you think about the innovation called the telegraph, which for the first time enabled information to travel great distances faster than it could be physically carried. And you've seen these in old westerns, right? The telegraph wires. And Lincoln was the one who figured out that you could give a very short address in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which very few people would hear. And because the telegraph would send a text to that address around the country, people would be reading it the next day. And then, of course, Franklin Roosevelt, who mastered radio as a form of communication. Right? For the first time, a president could talk to tens of millions of people at the same time. But realizing there are tens of millions of people, but they're in their homes, they're in groups of 3 and 4 and so on. So you do it in a conversational way. And of course, John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan with television. And Trump, I think, figured out that social media could be a way of going, it basically goes straight from here. A thought will pop into his head. He'll have an inspiration watching Fox and Friends or something else, or reading something. And when it goes straight from here down to his thumbs, into his phone, and out into the world. And if you think about Donald Trump, he's not somebody who can give sort of thoughtful, extended answers. What he can do, and what he's done masterfully, just from a political sense, is the quick hit, 140 character, 280 character hit. And by the way, much more effective at creating phrases that we all know, that stick in our minds. So fill in the blank with, let's have a little audience, blank Hillary. Everybody knows that, right? Blank Ted. Blank. We could get going here. Can you think of any blank?
Close to a revival meeting right now.
blank healthcare plan, blank
Drain the swamp.
infrastructure. Right? You see my point. He's very good at branding in a negative sense. Memorable phrases, whether we despise them or whether we salute them. Memorable. Other than Make America Great Again, which, by the way, he sort of borrowed from Ronald Reagan, that's it. So if you think about Trump's use of Twitter, it's innovative, and I think future presidents are going to, just as they learned from FDR and learned from JFK. But in terms of, a tool for expanding his base of support rather than reinforcing the support he's already got, that's where he hasn't really been anything like a great communicator. And even on the occasions earlier or late last year, you think about times in our recent history when a disaster has occurred that sort of shocked us all, and how we look to the president to speak the words that provide consolation and hope. Ronald Reagan, after the Challenger space shuttle exploded on national TV. Bill Clinton, after the terrorist bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. Barack Obama, after the shooting of 9 church people in Trump. We look to those presidents in those moments, and they were able to speak to all of us. And then you think about Hurricane Maria was that the one in Puerto Rico? And Trump going down there and complaining that people weren't just thrilled that he deigned to be among them, complaining about the criticisms he was getting. So part of being president is being the leader of the party that nominated you and prevailed in the election. Part of being president, too, is being able to speak for all of us in those moments when either through threat or inspiration, but those moments and so when Donald Trump gave that inaugural address, it's the 57th inaugural address in American history, and by far the darkest in tone. American carnage, crime and everywhere, and so on. Now, for the 46% of the American people who voted for him, that's kind of, okay, he's reminding them, this is why I voted for this guy. But when you're president of the United States. You're not just president of your political party anymore. I'm sorry, I went on too long with that. But,
no, it's all interesting. You mentioned somewhere that really when you look at it objectively, Trump comes into office, does not face any real crisis. Whatever crises ensue would seem to be crises of his own instigation. You mentioned also that probably didn't expect that he was going to win, but he did, and so has to govern. And we're in this odd situation now where even his critics, I think, thought once he gets into, if he does get into office, he'll be normalized. You just have to, the imperatives of governing are going to impose ineluctable discipline on you. It doesn't seem to have worked that way, and yet the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which waxes and wanes on Trump, but has been very critical of Trump throughout, pointed out that it seems to be a moderately successful presidency in terms of governing, and yet the impression remains of chaos, and the approval numbers are down at 35–36%, matching completely with the base.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because one of the things I try to do in this book is play it straight. Just provide a kind of narrative and analysis rather than a polemic. Almost everything that's been written about Trump has been either he's the devil or he's an angel. So a couple things in response to that. One is, when you compare presidents' first years over history, you realize how fortunate Donald Trump was to take office when he did. We were not experiencing the kind of economic crisis that Franklin Roosevelt and Barack Obama inherited. We were not at war. When Nixon became president, he inherited a war with 500,000 soldiers deployed in Vietnam. Abraham Lincoln gets elected and 7 states secede from the Union before he's even inaugurated. The inflation rate was down low, the unemployment rate was down low, the stock market had tripled over the previous 8 years, and there were no crises during his first year, other than sort of the one he manufactured with North Korea, and on top of that, he was elected a Republican president with a Republican Congress. And that, I think, has been, in some ways, his salvation, because Trump has pretty much deferred his legislative priorities to the Republican Party in Congress. The attempt to repeal Obamacare, well, Republicans have been trying to do that for years. It didn't work. But a tax cut, if a Republican president and a Republican Congress are elected and don't pass a tax cut, well, then, you know, we're on the brink of Armageddon, because that, for Republicans, is like what they do. It's who they are. An area, certainly, where Trump has been unusually successful and uniquely successful among modern presidents is getting judicial appointments nominated and confirmed. Not just the obvious one, the Supreme Court, but also one level below that, the federal courts of appeals, which are enormously important, and then the federal district court judges, which are also important. Trump has gotten more of those folks confirmed by the Senate, Republican Senate, than in any president in quite a few decades. I don't think this is something he's taken a hands-on role in, but he's put people in charge of it and allowed them to work their will. And then the other area in which I think Trump has been successful, and again, this is something you'd expect from any conservative Republican president, is in fostering deregulation by executive agencies of various sectors of the economy. That's, you know, that's something that certainly on the accomplishment side of the ledger, he gets credit for. Now, the stock market has boomed, but it's continued to boom. Again, it tripled during the previous 8 years. Inflation is low, the unemployment rate, but he inherited that. And I think one of his great dubious achievements as a candidate was to make us think as a country, we're in terrible shape, when by any historical measure, we're in very good shape. And his first year, thank God, didn't force him to make the kind of life-changing decisions for a country that, for example, Franklin Roosevelt had to make, or George W. Bush had to make after 9/11.
So those poll numbers, which are much lower than previous presidents who themselves had underwater poll numbers, normally translate into big losses in the first midterm election. Democrats only have to take a net of, is it 24 seats to take the House back? The second, let's talk about the second year just for a moment.
Sure.
The midterm, prospect of midterms is going to loom over the second year. Does that, you think, impose more systemic discipline, if I can put it that way, on the Trump presidency, or is it likely that things will continue to be as anarchical as they are now, Trump having a success here, stepping on his own message there with unforced errors and so on? What do you see that?
Well, I mean, the midterm elections this November may be the most consequential in our history. Midterm elections, of course, every seat in the House of Representatives is on the ballot, a third of the seats in the Senate. Lots of 2/3 of the governorships are on the ballot. There's elections all over the place, not for president, but everywhere else. And I think the 33rd Republican member of the House announced today he was retiring. There are a lot of Republicans in the House who are figuring, what's the point? Given how unpopular this president is, what's the point of even trying to get reelected? So I would be surprised if the Democrats don't regain control of the House. Now the Senate, right now, because of how the Alabama special election went, there are 51 Republicans in the Senate, 49 Democrats, right? It almost couldn't be closer. Now, on the face of it, the deck is stacked in the Republicans' favor this November because there are 26 Democratic seats that will be voted on this November and only 8 Republican seats. Why? Because 6 years ago, 2012, Democrats had a great year, and Senate terms were 6 years. If you look at the map, it's not hard to see this happening, if, despite the deck being stacked in the Republicans' favor this year, the Democrats actually take control of the Senate. Now it's not Trump and a Republican Congress. Now it's Trump and a Democratic Congress, which would love to use its powers of investigation and impeachment, conceivably. So we're now really getting into the realm of speculation. But who knows how this year is going to play out in terms of the special prosecutor's investigation. It's probably not going to be good for the Trump presidency, right? So if you can imagine a scenario, and we political scientists are a lot better at explaining things that have already happened and why it was obvious they were going to happen than predicting anything. Who knows what the unknowns will be this year. But if you get a situation in Washington where against all odds, the Democrats are in control of Congress. At the grassroots, the Democrats are ready to get rid of this guy. And if the special prosecutor gives them more raw material to work with, and if Republican members of Congress no longer think, I need to be scared of this guy, which they are now, because he has that bedrock of support in their own districts. There's no personal loyalty to Donald Trump among Republicans in Congress. He's not one of them. And if they think they can get away with it and make Mike Pence president, who is one of them, president of the United States, his support in Congress will vanish in a heartbeat. As long as Republican voters, and this is why I think Trump constantly reinforces that 35 or 38% support he has, as long as he can hang on to them, then Republican members of Congress are not going to feel safe in turning against him. But depending on how things play out over this coming year, it's possible they will, and that's why I say I'm not predicting by any means that he will be impeached and removed. But the fact that we're even talking about a scenario already in which that could happen is extraordinary.
Right. So you just said you don't want to speculate, but let me ask you to try a little bit. So far, as I said earlier, Trump defies the laws of natural science, and no one has discovered kryptonite yet. They're actively looking for it. The laws of natural science apply in Superman's world, I don't know, but there's no kryptonite so far. But as you just observe the response to the Mueller investigation, what we're all reading and talking about in the last few days, does it give you a sense that there must be something that really is more problematical than anyone has recognized in the Trump circle?
I haven't seen anything that to me, based on the information that's become available, would justify an impeachment. I know there are others who do. I haven't seen that yet. But just in terms of the political effects of a series of indictments of people who are part of the Trump network, that sort of feeds into at least historically, it's fed into a sense of disillusionment among that president's supporters. Now, whether they'll find anything that pins directly an impeachable offense on Trump, that may not be necessary in order to cause Republicans to desert him. Again and again you see, well, 80% of Republican people who identify as Republicans, voters who identify as Republican, 80% of them support President Trump. Poll after poll shows that. But you know, there are fewer Republicans now than there were a year ago. The denominator has grown smaller, or the numerator. Anyway, whatever number, it's grown smaller.
We don't have a math requirement in political science.
So that's the scenario. Now, I'm one of those guys, along with everybody else who does what I do for a living, who knew he wasn't going to get elected president, right? So there's a very good chance that this year will prove me wrong again. But based on sort of the pieces on the board as they're positioned now, I think it's going to be really tough for President Trump, even if he serves out the full term, if the Democrats take control, even of one house of Congress this November. If they get control of both of them, his life's going to get extremely difficult. And, you know, it's not even beyond the realm of possibility that he might just say at some point, the hell with it, I'm resigning. You know, life's too short. Again, it's the kind of thing you'd never occur to you to think about any previous president, that they may just figure the job's just no fun anymore. But with this guy, it's within the realm of plausibility.
Yeah. So let me ask one more question before turning the floor over to the audience. Bill Kristol remarked recently that the quote of the year actually belongs to James Madison from 1787. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. and that again underscores this interesting point about the presidency in a constitutional order, and we need to remember that. But this is what you write in your own conclusion. Throughout Trump's presidential campaign, the transition, the first 11 months in office, he displayed virtually no knowledge of history, no awareness of the depth of fierce partisan opposition that all of his recent predecessors have faced, no comprehension of how narrow his victory was. And you could add to that, apparently, and isn't it astonishing, no real demonstrated curiosity about the office and the history of the presidency that he was about to assume. It's clear that he has skills. You mentioned that, and you give him credit for that in your book. But it does seem that he doesn't have political skills.
Yeah.
Not that one necessarily would, but and in particular the political skills of a president. Given that, is it possible that even with 3 to 3.5% continued economic growth, which otherwise would make all problems diminish, do you think that it's sustainable?
Well,
another 2, 3.
The last thing I would say about Donald Trump is that he's stupid. He's not stupid, and anybody who thinks he is ignoring the fact that he's come as far as he has in life.
So he would say he's president, you're not.
He's president, but he's ignorant. Meaning, I mean, I'm ignorant about nuclear physics and obviously about even arithmetic. Right. He's ignorant. He's ignorant about the office, its history, the Constitution. You know, I've got one paragraph in there that really doesn't belong in the chapter it's in, but I just couldn't resist a kind of Trump's greatest hits paragraph, where he's talking to a Republican audience and he says, "Hey, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Did you guys know that?" Every Republican. He talked about Andrew Jackson as if he had been alive during the Civil War. He talked about Frederick Douglass as if he were alive today. And what he said about the Constitution in a meeting with House Republicans was, I'm going to protect Article 1 and Article 2 and Article 12 and on down the list. Well, there's only 7 articles in the Constitution. Never mind a longer list. This is somebody who 8th grade civics, right, passed him by entirely, never mind the rest of it. But it's the lack of curiosity.
Yeah.
It's one thing to be ignorant. It's another thing to be complacent in your ignorance. And what we haven't seen with President Trump is a desire to kind of learn more about what it means to be a leader. That said, he may not know about the Constitution, but the Constitution knows about him. And this book really ends on a very reassuring note, I think, for those who worry about, are we headed toward authoritarian government, totalitarian government, that he may not realize that Congress and the courts and the American people and the free press have the constitutional authority to rein in a president. Another quote from James Madison, right? Ambition shall be made to counteract ambition. And that's kind of the premise, that if any president or any other individual in government strays too far from an acceptable path of government, well, believe me, there are other people in that government who have the authority and the motivation to rein them in. And so for me, the great joy of writing this book, which was a lot of fun. I mean, one thing with Trump, you are never, ever bored, right? But the great joy was kind of realizing, the Constitution really does work. And as bad as things might get, they won't get catastrophically bad. And that's, that's something that cause you to sleep through the night.
Yeah. Well, let's hear from the audience. We'll spend about another 15 minutes perhaps, but I want to try and formally wrap up by about 7 o'clock. I have a personal rule that the first and last question has to go to a student. Yes.
What type of things do you think he'll address in the State of the Union address?
Well, I know what anybody, I don't know anything more than anybody else knows. So apparently from the leaks that have been coming out of the White House, infrastructure, he'll be bragging about the economy and taking credit for it. Infrastructure, immigration certainly, national defense. State of the Union addresses are part of that long history of the office. And it's one of the things you have to do under the Constitution is report to Congress on the State of the Union from time to time. And so as you watch that speech tomorrow night, I think you will see Trump in his most traditional presidential behavior. The question will be, because whenever Donald Trump gives like a prepared speech, which you can tell he'd rather not be doing. He's much more comfortable being a stream of consciousness guy, but there are some things you just have to prepare and deliver. Here's a prediction I'll make, which you can either prove me right or wrong on in a week. Sometime before this week is out, he will decide to launch another Twitter burst. Because he'll just be tired of being a conventional president, even for a few days, and boom, he'll be off. I don't know, the Super Bowl is Sunday, so he doesn't have much time to complain about the NFL again. But basketball season is going on, so he may go after Stephen Curry again. There are plenty of annoying people and plenty of annoying countries out there that he likes to tweet against. My prediction, which I will not bet on, but I will predict, sometime in the week after he gives that inaugural address, he will erupt. He was on this trip to Asia for 12 days. And for 9 days, he was just behaving himself, meaning behaving the way presidents do on foreign trips. And then on the 10th day, 17 tweets, just bam, 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 all the stored up desire to get that finger back on the keypad.
I'm betting it happens Wednesday morning. We'll involve the reply by Joe Kennedy. Very hard to resist. Question over here, ma'am? Yes.
I just wanted to say that you concluded your remarks with what I came to and hoped that I would hear. So you made me feel much.
Did you all hear that? That was really smart.
You promised peace in our time. Yes.
I have one. He seemed, I'm no psychologist, and no, I don't think he's crazy. But he seems so emotionally immature. He seems to be, he can't stand it if somebody disagrees with him and he rips into them. he has his feelings or his ego hurt, so he rips out at people. You know, Rocket Man, and he tries to outdo some, and it's all so silly. But there's a certain danger in that, it seems to me. And how does that play into who he is as a president? What does it? I'll leave it at that.
Well, you know, silly and dangerous.
Yeah.
But you use both words, and I sort of oscillate between the two. When, you know, for years, for decades, the leaders of North Korea have just made these ongoing, outrageous statements about the United States, and no previous president has ever thought, well, I need to get down there in the gutter and slug it out with them, until President Trump. You know, I'm looking at a young, untested, sort of wacky leader of North Korea, and I'm thinking, why rattle that guy's cage, right, when he's got nuclear weapons? So that's the dangerous thing. And again, the only crisis of President Trump's first year has been the one he manufactured by, in effect, responding to North Korea in kind. So that's worrisome. Most of it, I think, is just silly stuff. It's just, as you said, feeling like he's got to belittle. Another example from North Korea. So the North Korean government puts out a statement describing Trump as an old lunatic. He responds by complaining about the fact that they said he was old. I got a kick out of it, right? You know, I'm always looking at this. I'm looking at this class, which is almost empty, and saying it's half full. So I'm hoping that the silliness is the worst of it, and the dangerous stuff doesn't actually turn into what could be, you know, a real disaster.
Thank you. Nina?
Some scholars and pundits have attached to Trump an ideology of Trumpism.
Yeah.
Do you believe that such an ideology exists, and if so, what constitutes Trumpism, and do you believe that Trumpism can exist without Trump?
Is there such a thing as Trumpism? And if there, so I'll say no. And then I don't have to get to the second part of the question. Will it last beyond Trump? No, he's somebody who, over the years, has sort of developed kind of scattered opinions about this and that, and they haven't really aligned with any particular ideology that's out there, which served him well in the election. For example, you ask Republican leaders, this has been studied, Republican leaders, do we need to reform our entitlement programs and sort of reduce, and most of them say yes. And you ask Republican voters the same question, no, they want Social Security benefits increased. You ask Republican leaders about immigration, therefore opening up the borders. You ask Republican voters, no. So Trump kind of got that. And when he was elected, it sort of seemed like, okay, he is somebody who may not have a well-formulated philosophy, but he has positions on issues that he's thought out. But then you look at the record of his first year, and essentially his agenda, his policy agenda, has been the agenda that any Republican who was elected last year would have had. Tax cuts, try to repeal Obamacare, deregulation, conservative judges, right? So I think what that tells me is the beliefs he had, which got good reactions from crowds and helped him get elected, were not beliefs that really were deeply embedded in who he was. And when it came to the challenges of governing, he was basically happy to outsource that to the Republican Congress. Again, if you don't have a Republican Congress this time next year, who's he going to outsource his agenda to?
Mike, would you include immigration as one of those things that really didn't come from any deep conviction but popped up during the campaign?
I don't know. I mean, he's somebody who you know, the first time Donald Trump thought of running for president was in 1988. And he took out a big ad. He didn't get into the race, but he sort of flirted with it. And he took out a big ad in newspapers. And his main complaint in the ad was that we were paying for the national defense of countries like Japan and Saudi Arabia. So there is the thread there is that Trump thinks foreigners are trying to screw us. That, I think, is a deeply held belief. Foreigners are taking advantage of us, and we always get played for suckers. So even though the United States, in the aftermath of World War II, basically created the regime of free trade and international organizations, and that has served us very well, Donald Trump somehow thinks that we're getting the short end of the stick. And part of that is people sneaking into the country, right? Bringing their foreign accents and their weird food. So I think he's somebody who just has a kind of visceral, deeply rooted antipathy toward people who aren't Americans in the sense of European Americans. And you know, I'm always reluctant to throw around labels like racist, which I think are powerfully charged. But you can't look at the targets he's singled out more than others through his use of Twitter, for example, and not think, boy, he sure goes after an awful lot of African Americans, right? Again, playing to this idea that when America was great, if we're going to make America great again, the America that he's thinking of is the America of, I don't know, the 50s, when we were basically a white country, and kind of that's the vision. So that, I do think, is something that Trump has some sort of visceral, long-standing beliefs, might be too strong a word, just instincts about. Foreigners are bad if they're not European whites.
You mentioned 1988. If you Google Trump 1988 GOP convention, you'll find about a 7.5-minute montage of interview clips with Donald Trump, which are quite revealing. And in one of them, Chris Wallace asks jocularly, "Do you have any ideas about running for president, Mr. Trump?" And his answer was, "You know, I think I could do it. I really think I can do it. I see these guys. I think I could do it." It's worth looking at. It explains quite a bit. Amy, did you have a question?
I think you covered it.
Well,
Yes.
kind of on this same subject, so more timely, what do you think of the deal he's kind of put forward to the Democrats to legalize, was it 1.5 million undocumented immigrants to try and get the wall? But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, this you know, obviously this is an ongoing source of division that precedes the Trump presidency, right? What do we do about the fact that there are, by estimations, 11 million people living in our country who didn't come into our country through legal means? And what do you especially do with the fact that a number of them were born here? I mean, their parents brought them in as young children, or they were born here, the so-called dreamers. And I think there's an area where Trump at least is willing to deal with Democrats whose goal is make America a welcoming place for those folks. And if the deal would be something like, okay, we'll find a way to do that, especially for the children who were brought here and grew up here. But I want that wall, right? The wall has become an obsession for, remember, how did this guy make his money originally? He's a builder, he's a developer. So when he thinks about, you know, protecting our borders, he thinks of some sort of structure. I honestly think that it's important enough to do something for, as you say, well over 1 million young people whose legal status is still uncertain. Give him his wall. Who cares, right? It's $25 billion, but honestly, $25 billion to settle this issue?
Mike, the polling suggests that even among his core supporters, the wall, immigration, doesn't rank all that high. So isn't that part of the argument again?
Yeah.
He has said that when he was on the campaign, freestyling, he happened to mention, and we're gonna build a wall, and everybody went nuts. So he kept saying it,
Yeah.
same Pavlovian response. So he doesn't seem to be principally concerned about it. And if there's no real price to pay for moving back from a big demand in order to get a deal and get a W, right? Why not? That still remains.
Dan, you've been married a long time, and you're the father of 3 kids. Have you ever gotten into one of these really dumb arguments where something that you didn't especially
That
care
never
about,
happens.
but suddenly, it becomes like, because I think and not just for Trump, but for other presidents, part of appealing to voters is giving them what they want. But part of it is showing that you made a promise and have kept it. And I think that's, whether he stumbled out onto a limb on the wall thing, or whether he strode out on that issue, that's become the one, it's sort of the one thing where if he does it, and he's able to run for re-election, I told you I'd build a wall, and by God, there it is, right? So I think there's a kind of emotional investment in seeing that, and the Democrats would do well to just say, if you'll give us something that really matters, you can have the wall.
Or a wall system. I have a contractor who just took down a bathroom wall, and now he's putting up a wall system and charging me for it. So let's have one more question before we formally wrap up, and make it a hard ball.
No.
So it has to be a student. There's a rule. Mr. Carlotta.
So as a Filipino, when people ask me about Filipino politics, they'd say like, oh, what's the state of Filipino politics? Well, I would say a guy like Manny Pacquiao, a famous boxer, can become president of the Philippines. With no experience, he can become president. Well, in America, we have Donald Trump, who had no previous political experience, become president of America. Now you see a lot of people like The Rock, Jay-Z, people like that say, I'm going to run for office. They think they can do it. I guess you don't have to necessarily give like if it's good or bad for the country, but what does that say about the state of the American presidency as someone who knows it like the back of your hand? When many people who have no experience in office are saying, I'm going to run for office because Donald Trump did it and it's possible.
Yeah. I didn't plant that question, but I love it because one of the things I point out in this book is that the talent pool from which we have drawn our presidents has sort of shifted over the years. So if you think about the 25, 30 years after World War II, World War II ends in 1945. And for the next 2-3 decades, almost all our presidents come from the world of government, but in particular government in Washington. They've been senators, they've been vice presidents, Harry Truman, generals in the case of Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, everyone, all those presidents. Voters clearly thought it was important that the president be somebody who had experience in government, and in particular in the federal government, which, after all, had just lived through the Depression and beat the Axis in World War II. So not surprisingly, people valued that experience. And then along comes the Vietnam War, and then along comes the Watergate crisis, and starting in the mid-1970s, we still want people with experience in government, but not in Washington. Right? So we get Governor Jimmy Carter, Governor Ronald Reagan, Governor Bill Clinton, Governor George W. Bush. Well, if you think about the next iteration of that trend, it's somebody with no experience in Washington and no experience in government who basically runs for president by saying, I'm the guy to send in to drain the swamp because I've never been part of that swamp. And you're right, Francis, we're hearing now, Mark Zuckerberg, Mark Cuban, Oprah. I think in a sense a door has been opened for better or worse. One of the points I make in this book is that yes, it's easy to look at Donald Trump and say he came out of the world of business. He came out of a particular slice of the world of business. He never was the head of a publicly traded corporation that had to deal with an independent board of directors. He never ran a business where he had to share power. But the way presidents do with Congress. And instead, he ran basically a small family operation where his word goes. So I'm not averse to the idea of broadening the talent pool, not only to include women and minorities and others who historically have been marginalized, but also to entertain the possibility that somebody could come out of the world of business or some other sector. But I'd want them to have the kind of experience at sharing power with other stakeholders that a president will have. And I'd like them to be people who really do want to know about the history of the office that they're seeking and the Constitution in which they will be serving. And we haven't seen that so far, but the right kind of person coming out from the world of politics with the right kind of background, that's something to consider.
Mike Nelson, thanks very much.